Good morning, beautiful people.
Good morning, Babz.
Good morning, Jeff Grant.
How you doing?
I'm all right. If y'all just tuned in, you've got Criminal Justice Insider with Babz Rawls-Ivy and Jeff Grant.
That's true. Sponsored by
the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven.
Now more than ever.
Yay!
All right.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year. This is our second show of the new year, so we still got a lot of energy.
Oh, yeah. We have a guest who drove like 100 hours to get here.
Oh, my God.
Took a ferry and everything.
I love our guests because they come from all points beyond, and they come with such enthusiasm, and so that makes us very happy. So before we introduce our guests, before we introduce Serena Ligori, Jeff and I are going to talk a little bit about what's going on in each of our criminal justice lives. So shout out to Lynn Springer.
And Andrew Kaplan. How you doing out there? Hope you're listening in. Oh, Andrew won't be listening in.
No, Andrew's on his way to sunnier shores.
Guatemala.
Well, he will immerse himself in all things Spanish.
Yeah.
So
no criminal justice insider in Guatemala.
Unless we do a remote podcast.
Remote would be great. Speaking of remotes, I heard a rumor that we might be doing a remote in 2-3 months.
Yes, not a rumor. It's a done deal, isn't it?
It's a done deal, but I don't think we're ready to quite announce it yet.
We won't say it yet.
But
this begins our tour.
Oh yeah, it is our world tour. Yeah, but we will have an exciting announcement coming up. We're going to be live on stage.
Yes. Jeff and I are taking this gig on the road,
but we are not ready to announce quite yet.
So you and Jackie and Jackie Polverari are speaking at Albertus Magnus College in March.
Yeah, they have a justice panel that they do every year, and they've invited the two of us to speak on March 23rd.
That'd be nice.
Really nice. And it's going to be twice, one for the day students, one for the night students. The public is invited. I have no idea what I'm going to do for the 4 hours in between, but we'll figure that out.
Yes.
And so that's on March 23rd at Albertus Magnus, and we'll be making, as the reservation link comes up, we'll put it out there.
And you're speaking at Michigan State in May.
And there's a white collar conference on May 28th.
I didn't know there was such a thing.
There is. And I'm
going to pass on that.
It's not a how-to guide. No.
I thought I was going to sharpen my skills.
No. But it'll have academics, and it'll have formerly incarcerated people and people from all different parts of the ecosystem, put on by our friend Jay Kennedy out there.
Okay.
And I am very grateful that they're flying me out, and we're going to be able to speak at that. And we have people from all over the country on our support group who are.
I'm looking forward to the pictures.
Oh yeah.
Because I know you're going to put I know you're going to put the pictures up, Jeff, because you are a social media queen.
The pictures will be up as we speak.
I know. I can't wait to see him.
Yep.
I can't wait to see him.
Yep.
So Serena Ligori is our guest. Oh, wait.
Oh, no, we got one more thing.
The Connecticut Hall of Change inaugural ceremony is Thursday, April 9th. And they are taking nominations because they're creating awards for people who do criminal justice work.
Yeah, I think everyone
who have come out of prison
and have changed their lives around.
But you had to have been out of prison for a particular amount of time.
I think it's 5 years.
5 years.
I think, but this is a really groundbreaking initiative put together by our friend Charlie Grady.
Yes,
who was here not too long ago, and an amazing amount of support by the state and nonprofits and business. And the award ceremony will be in Hartford on, you have the date, I'm sorry.
April 9th.
April 9th.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am talking to Charlie right after this broadcast.
Yes.
So if you're listening live, I'm speaking to him next. And, we'll see if it's another opportunity to get them on or do a remote.
Oh, that would be
whatever.
nice. That would be nice. That would be nice.
Oh, yeah.
So they're taking nominations on their website. Hang Time in Real Time?
No, hangtimerealtalk.com.
Hangtimerealtalk.com.
And you get clicked through to their
So
survey.
if you know any criminal justice folks that you really want to nominate for an award who are doing this hard work out here, raising awareness around criminal justice,
yeah,
feel free.
Babz,
feel free to nominate.
Yeah, Babz, I would never go so far as to ask our listeners to nominate you. Okay, that's some.
Nor are you,
No,
Jeff.
exactly. I understand, but just in case, that's Babz Rolls Ivy
and Jeff Grant. Shameless. All right. So our guest today is Serena Ligori, Executive Director for New Hour for Women and Children, Long Island. She is responsible for all aspects of New Hour's operations, fundraising, and administration. Serena is formerly incarcerated. She is a formerly incarcerated Latina and 18-year prisoner rights advocate. She is also responsible for nurturing partnerships with organizations and funders focused on social justice and legislative advocacy. She's also responsible for creating ways in which New Hour remains at the forefront of social justice initiatives locally and throughout New York State. And prior to joining the New Hour staff, she was the executive director of Her Story Writers Workshop, a nonprofit dedicated to providing writing workshops to underserved populations.
Oh, she's one of your folks, Bob.
Yes.
She's a writer.
Gotta love the writer.
Right.
Are you still doing that work?
I still coordinate very regularly with them, and I am still writing.
Oh, good. So let me finish, because this is such good work here.
Yep.
She also serves as She also serves as associate director of policy at the Correctional Association of New York's Women in Prison Project, where she spearheaded legislative initiatives and policy advocacy addressing prison reform. She was the key organizer of a successful effort to create the Adoption and Safe Families Act, expanded discretion law, which works to secure parental rights for incarcerated parents, as well as anti-shackling law. Recently, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, which allows survivor defendants to be sentenced more fairly. She earned her associate's degree at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility College, Bound program, and holds a BA in liberal arts from Adelphi University. Serena enjoys cooking her favorite traditional Puerto Rican meals for her family. Welcome.
Yes, thank
Hola.
you. Hola.
Wow. So how long did you serve in Bedford Hills?
So I was at Bedford at age 19 for 3 years. So I came home at 21. Interestingly, I had a birthday cake that some of my sisters behind bars made, and even one of the officers sang "Happy 21st Birthday" in prison. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
That's got to be
in the microwave, right?
And no, we had a little hot pot that they made. We did a lot. We used the top of cans to cut up. We're going back now.
That prison life, boy. The creativity that flows up out of there.
Yeah, you don't look like an OG.
An OG. That we were in Albany just this Tuesday advocating for the aging population. And I ran into two of the women who worked on, banning shackling of pregnant women. And we said, we're the OG. We've been doing this a really long time.
Connecticut we just passed our laws in the last legislative session to stop shackling pregnant women.
Excellent.
Which when I think about that, I'm just blown away and baffled by why that is a thing. Why did anybody think that was, like, where are you going to go as a woman who is just giving birth or in the process of giving birth? You're not going to run.
And that's the interesting thing. Back in 2009, when we were working on this bill, then New York State Governor Patterson, we went back and forth where they were weighing whether this would be good or bad. And somebody at some point said, if you're in labor, if you've ever been in labor, you are not leaving, running, walking anywhere. So it's just not feasible.
Yes.
And but really, it is a form of barbaric torture. And I think, especially for women who are incarcerated, we survive so much. And there's sexual assault, there's abuse, there's trauma, there's layers and layers that, the criminal justice system perpetuates. And I think it's increasingly important to talk about it as it relates to women, because it's certainly we're the largest growing population of prisoners.
Yes.
As the men are slowly, thankfully, the rates are dropping. There's a rise in women being incarcerated.
And I think that's probably directly in correlation to drugs and contraband and stuff like that, because women oftentimes are the mules and there's hiders of boyfriends and that kind of thing.
There's a lot of coercion, and that's really, when we were talking about the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, the kind of work behind that law now is that judges can take into consideration if somebody is a survivor of abuse and may have been coerced into a crime because of that abuse. And it's what we see in the local jail. We work with about 1,000 women a year, and 9 out of 10 are survivors of serious abuse, and often say if they were engaged. We also believe in accountability and responsibility for your actions, but we recognize that women's pathways are often the criminalization of mental illness, the criminalization.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's much more layered and complex than people like to think, as we know.
You know what they say in the 12-step rooms, that men come into the program beat up by life and women come into the program beat up by men.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Not always, but I would say that pain perpetuates pain. And I would also say that, you know, for women who go through our leadership program, our Emerge program, many of the women say, if I had had a program like this when I was 17 versus now at 30, I would not have recidivated. I would not have gone back to using drugs to cover up pain and all of the things that, you know, folks rely on substances for.
So when you come out of prison at 21, what do you know?
Nothing.
And how did you know? Like, what was the pathway to get you here?
Yes. So I love this question because at 21, I had already lived a whole existence of trauma and pain and felt really old. But the truth is, I knew absolutely nothing and was really vulnerable to choosing unhealthy relationships, being on my own. One of the things I did was I got a job. I rode my bike to a coffee place and started working. And my parole officer, God bless their soul, would intimidate by showing up on the line. So you couldn't, the coffee shop was so busy that you really didn't look up. And all of a sudden, there would be their face standing there. And I would think, are you here to rearrest me? What am I doing wrong? So the level of intimidation that somebody who comes home from prison at such a young age, it's incredible. I didn't know what to ask for. I didn't know I deserved counseling or deserved to have support. And unfortunately, I still see women coming home. I have a 20-year-old who's interning in our office, and it's like a flashback because she just embodies everything I was some 21 years ago.
Was it hard for you to get the job at the coffee shop?
Yes, it was hard. Interestingly, I had somebody who decided to hire me who had a history of substance abuse. And so they understood not why I, not everything about why I was there, and, my family and mental illness that coerced me into being part of an unfortunate tragedy. But they understood that people deserve second chances. And so for that, I'm really thankful.
Okay. So you come out at 21. What do you do? Well, you go back home with people, with your family?
No.
Are you welcome there? What?
I had a mending relationship with my father. And so it wasn't a space where I was going back to. And interestingly, I had made friends with a woman who was a wonderful volunteer in the jail, and we stayed in touch for the 3 years I was gone. And she offered me a place to stay in her home.
Wow.
Until I went back to college. And she's since passed. She was just a very unique and wonderful person. Without that, I would have been in a shelter. I didn't have the support or the planning. When you're up in Bedford, you might as well be on Mars. You're not connected to anyone or anything. Or
any prison, for that matter.
Any prison.
But they did have college courses, right?
They did have college courses, and that was my saving grace. You stepped into that college room, and you were no longer a prisoner. You were a student. And that change and shift in identity every night, when you got on that program line at 6:30 or whatever, and you went off and the professors treated you like a student, it was my lifeline to my self-image, because so much of my image, self-esteem had been destroyed by what had happened. And interestingly, I I was talking with a friend of mine. She says, "Oh, well, do you know what everybody in Bedford did?" And I said, "No, us women, we never talked about our crimes."
Yeah.
And
That's, you're right.
We never talked about, and part of me feels like I almost wish we had, because we would have realized we had so much in common. Almost all of us were survivors of abuse, survivors of all kinds of family violence, and we could have really leaned on each other.
Well, I don't think that, you know what? I was there I was where I was in Danbury almost 15 years ago. They don't encourage that kind of sharing. Like, I think that's a good idea if somebody could come in and help facilitate those kinds of conversations amongst women to share, so that you do see the similarities in everybody's humanity, right? In everybody's story.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's a code of honor, right? Which is, I don't ask you, you don't ask me. Let's just be here and be, nice to each other and support each other. But there is a level missing when you're not able to really see how you identify with any other woman you're incarcerated with. And so it took years later. And now, I was in Albany, reunited with some of the women who I had spent years with and who then spent decades there. And we came back together and said, wow, we are all such amazing survivors. And we weren't able to acknowledge that then, because nobody was talking about it.
Wow. Yeah. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about your advocacy work.
So,
because I think we can be on the boots on the ground, but if nobody is talking to the legislative bodies about how to change some of this, then we're still stuck at ground zero.
Yes. And I think for a long time when I came home, probably till I was about 25 or 26, I said, I'm going to put this behind me. I'm going to pretend this never happened. That kind of identity crisis is something that I imagine a lot of people struggle with, especially if you can get a job and you can just sort of jump back into life, but you feel a little bit like a fraud. Because while I was at Manhattanville College and living in the dorm and had a wonderful experience and met some wonderful people, I wasn't a college kid. I was a survivor of trauma, of abuse, of isolated confinement, of somebody who had seen horrible things happen in prison and people be hurt. And I was not really, almost like coming back from a war, right? You're just not going to fit back into the community. Fast forward, I began to I applied and worked at the Correctional Association with a wonderful team, Bob Ganji, the ED back then, and Tamar Kraft-Stoller. And I suddenly realized they had sent me a DVD that had on it women going to Albany to advocate for criminal justice issues. And it was like my world had opened. And I suddenly realized my calling. I realized that not only could I use my experience and all of this pain, but I could impact others. And that for me was a turning point. That was where I found my freedom for real on the outside. And we mobilized hundreds of women to advocate, and families. And the more I started talking to people, the more I realized everybody had somebody they knew who had been in prison.
And still.
And still does. So, especially on Long Island, people like to hide things. You don't know that you're
anywhere, not just Long Island.
No, but it's really interesting. When I first read about you and then contacted you, what I thought was, most people around the country think that Long Island is a very homogenous world of affluence, and the fact that you're Latina, you've been to prison, you're a woman who's in leadership. No, not the stereotypical view of what a Long Islander is.
That's right. And I think the stereotypical view of Long Island is hopefully going to change, because we are, unfortunately, very racially segregated. We have huge pockets of poverty, and you cross over one highway and you go from Hempstead, where there's huge poverty, to Garden City, where there's huge wealth and old wealth. Yeah. And one of the things on Long Island that I'm hoping to really change and affect, having worked in New York City for years and then come back to Long Island to raise my son and have my family, I suddenly realized that we need to do something and call out those who are overtly racist and biased against those who've been incarcerated. Out on Long Island, we still haven't passed fair hiring practices in Suffolk County. It's passed in New York City in 2015. And in Suffolk County, there is still really a divide about why we should help people who've been incarcerated and how they can give back. And hopefully New Hour is showing our community that not only do women come home, but that they don't return to prison. That, you know, if you've, especially women who've committed violent crimes, they don't return to prison. They do their time, they come home, and they start fresh. And a lot of times it is linked to, as you said, Babz, to domestic violence. And I think that hopefully we're going to start to see a shift, especially because there is such broad spread bipartisan support for criminal justice reform throughout the nation.
Well, because it's expensive to keep warehousing people.
And, you know, one of the expensive parts, you know, are taxes.
Yes.
People don't want to think about safety and taxes in the same sentence when it comes to, okay, well, we don't want bail reform. We don't want people who are poor to be able to, you know, afford their bail. But we want people to stay in jail because they're safe there. They're not going to hurt us. Well, the truth is that most people, are not dangerous, and they do deserve to be out on bail, and it's saving money. You know, the prison industrial complex, as we know, is expensive.
It is.
Very.
And that's why that's why, you know, a lot of these states are having these big conversations around, you know, how do we close prisons? What are the alternatives to incarceration? Like, how do we alleviate this tax burden? Because there, you know, we sprung up all these prisons, for-profit prisons, state prisons, all kinds of prisons, and now we can't afford them.
We can't afford them. And the other piece of that is that often, you know, while we run a program in the jail, and we are very grateful for a sheriff who is supportive and really a visionary in terms of thinking about programming and rehabilitation, most sheriffs aren't thinking that way. You know, maybe some are. Most prisons are not invested in rehabilitation as much as incarceration and just keeping you there till you've done your time. I have women that call us from the state facilities. I'm coming home in a month. I'm coming back to Long Island. I have no plans. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know where I'm going to live. You know, that kind of reentry processing should be happening from day one in the prisons.
Yes.
And the truth is, every prison and jail, they're their own fiefdom. They run according to their own sheriff or superintendent. There's no mandatory minimum in terms of how things should be run or you know, a level of accountability. I mean, there are folks who say they have accountability for those things, but we see that prisons create trauma, and that creates, you know, unsafety in our community when folks come home and they're desperate. They don't know where they're going to live.
Yes.
How much of a problem or maybe advantage is it that that you're headquartered in Suffolk, but that's like so far away from where the conversation is happening in Albany or even in New York City? People don't realize how many people are on Long Island. There in Nassau and Suffolk County, there's as many people as there are in the whole state of Connecticut, and yet it's very hard to get to and maybe divorced from the mainstream conversation. So what happens with that?
That's a great question, because Long Island is bigger than 30 states or 33 states, the population.
And not even the New York City parts of Long Island, just Nassau and Suffolk.
And you know, that's news to me. I did not know that.
Yes, there's a lot of people living there. And the other piece that I think is important to highlight is at the state level, many advocates and organizations are realizing that Long Island senators actually vote as a block often, and those 6 senators can dictate quite a bit of the New York State politics. So it is very interesting to think about how Long Island plays into this role, and really, how do we take full advantage of this role? Because I think Long Islanders don't understand their power.
So is that so is your advocacy focused more or less on the legislative body? Like, do you do your best to get to that block to sort of say, listen, see us, and this is our concern?
Yes, and I think one of the things that we've been really focusing on is voting rights and voter enfranchisement, because people who come home from prison and jail often don't realize how powerful their voice can be and how important it is, if they can vote, that they should. And, we saw this with Lester Holt holding, conversations with lawmakers and inside Angola prison. This is the right time. This is the time to say to our state senators, where do you stand on voting rights for prisoners? Where do you stand on domestic violence and women who've served time? Where do you stand on your aging population of prisoners and their ability to be seen by a parole board, even if they have a life sentence? These are questions they've never been asked before. We sat down with some of our senators on Long Island, and honestly, many of them are interested but have not heard these questions before, and they should be hearing them.
Wow.
This should be part of that vetting process for every candidate. And I would hope that we're moving towards candidates who understand that the criminal justice community can have an impact on state law, and that we should, and that they should be thinking about how their role in this work is going to change lives. Because so many, on Long Island, we have a heroin epidemic. We have a sex trafficking, human trafficking epidemic. 1 in 10 women in our jail have said that they have survived human trafficking, and many to support opioid addiction.
And gangs on Long Island. People don't know about MS-13. Well, it's been in the paper a lot lately.
Yes,
but Long Island has pockets that are gang territory.
Yes, there are a lot of issues. I would say that unfortunately, when people hear President Trump talking about coming to where we work in Brentwood because he's saying it's gang involved, we would argue against that. We live in the community, and while MS-13 is a problem, it is not just our problem. And I think that there's a quick and easy way to label folks, especially kids.
Yeah. I've had this conversation over the years when I served as a city legislator, and the bandying about the word of gangs.
Yes.
Yes. There's some specific language that speaks to what a gang is, and sometimes people just sort of arbitrarily slap that on a group of kids, and then everybody's like, "Oh, I see a gang of kids," and then they automatically think some organized crime kind of thing is happening.
And we see it a lot on Long Island. We talk all the time. If you're a person of color and you're in the community and you're standing next to a certain area, you are, you're deemed guilty before you've done anything, and you maybe are not doing anything. And so we would love to see our police department have more education about how they profile. And I think racism and bias on Long Island is a big issue. It's a big issue, and folks are completely segregated. They just had a housing expose about what the realtors are still doing. They did this to my grandparents who moved from Puerto Rico to the Bronx to Long Island, and they said, "Oh, you want a house in Brentwood, not in Smithtown." Well, the houses in Smithtown now are $1 million houses, or $700,000 and up, and accruing this great financial gain, and yet they had accents, and so they were pushed into a certain area.
That redlining.
And that redlining happens, and it's
Still
crazy
happening.
that it's still happening.
Yeah, still happening for sure.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about what New Hour does.
Yes.
What are you charged with doing?
So New Hour is really, it's a great story. There is a wonderful couple, George and Patty Krause, and they live on the East End of Long Island. And every year for their daughter's birthday, they do something wonderful. And one year she said, "Dad, I'm turning 35. I want to do something to give back." And she did some research and found an organization called Our Children, which is in Queens, which does a very similar model to ours. In fact, we piloted our model after theirs. Her dad said, "Well, that sounds great, but," and they talked and they said, "But what's on Long Island? Is there anything on Long Island that works with women who've been incarcerated?" Well, there was nothing. There was not one nonprofit that's sole mission was dedicated to supporting women and children.
What year was this?
2014.
Wow.
Yes, 2014.
And there were women that were going to prison from Long Island, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
And so Sister Tisa Fitzgerald, who's the wonderful executive director,
we know her. We love her.
Yep. Well, sister and I knew each other very, very well. And she called me and she said, would you meet with this man? He is interested in supporting something. And so I met with him and he asked me about my story and what led me to prison, and told him about family violence and, mental illness in my family and the tragedies that took place and how I had been working hard to kind of recover my life and help others. And he said, do me a favor. Would you write up a plan? Would you create a vision for what you could imagine Long Island having? And I was blown away. I created what was our blueprint for this organization. And I put in it everything that I didn't get when I was incarcerated and when I came home. So we do direct service in the jails, parenting program, reentry training, discharge planning, health and wellness, women's support. And then we also included for their children and their families a support group, a leadership and training institute that runs twice a year with 15 women a session, where we bring in speakers, we bring in resources. And that model was really modeled after the work I did at the Correctional Association's Women in Prison Project. They had a trauma-informed leadership program. And the whole point of that program was then to make sure that women give back, that they understand what are the underlying issues that cause women to become incarcerated. So many women come into our program and they're beaten down by life and by their experiences, by their abuser, by prison, by jail. And they say, I just want my kids back. I don't know how to do that. I just want a safe house. Where do I start? I don't have a job and I need employment. So women come to us with their specific needs. They meet with our social worker, meet with our program director. But most of all, it's a safe space where there's a sense of community. They don't have and haven't had a space where you can say, I was in prison or jail and that means something. And now I need support and I want to give back. And so we had a young woman come in with her mother, and her mother said, she's out, she's here, she's doing okay, but she has no support. So we have monthly support group meetings, and we have reentry
I think
bags.
that's so critical, because I see when I came out from federal time, and I remember coming back into the community, and there was no place that I could go to like share with people who had just come through what I come through.
Yes.
Right? Like, this is just not conversation you can have at a cocktail party.
No.
Right? Like, because everybody gets all freaked out when you say, oh, I served a little time or whatever.
Yes.
So I understand that when there's no place for women to talk about, because when you get out, what do they tell you? You got to find housing. If you want your kids back, you got to go do this. You may have a probation officer or a parole officer who is like janky. So you got to deal with that hoops. And then they want you to show up to parole, and they never show up you never get to show up in times that's conducive with work. Right. So
yeah. Yes. And you have to find transportation.
So you have to find transportation
to get there. And that could take 2 or 3. You got to pay for that.
And God knows how long you're going to be there. So.
I mean, I remember sitting in parole, waiting to be seen. I was one of 2 women in the whole building filled with men. I was a young woman. I was 21. And it was intimidating. And you don't know who to talk to, who to trust. And your parole officer doesn't give you guidance or support. We often say naming something, right, is really helping you to take away the power that has over your life, whether it be substance abuse or any abuse. Saying that you've been incarcerated and being able to say that in a space and not be judged, and to say, oh, I identify with you, I know what you've been through, is so valuable in the healing process for women. And that's what New Hour affords.
But there's a real cultural difference between women being accepted back into families, and they've handed off their children to relatives, and maybe even the children are identified as victims, for example, so that they can't reconnect with them, or they can't live with them without jumping over some hurdles.
Yes. And many women often say they've been charged with endangering the welfare of a child, which sounds very scary, child neglect. And it may not have been that there was an altercation against the child. The child was just there when there was drugs in the house. And, we don't make excuses for women or their behavior, but we say to our women all the time, if you will always be your child's mother, whether they take away your rights or not. We will help you fight to keep those rights if you are doing the right thing and want to be in your child's life. The interesting thing about kids, right, is that they love you no matter what.
They do.
They are unconditionally, they love their parents and they want their parents in their lives. And I think people often, especially the court system, they move to terminate parental rights for moms and for fathers, but really the primary caretaker often is the mother. 3/4 of our women are moms. And they don't realize that you can't decide that someone is not your child. Your child is never going to say that's not their biological parent, whether you terminate rights or not. And so there's a lot of healing that has to happen in the system to help mend families who've been impacted. And incarceration, as we know, doesn't do a whole lot to mend.
No.
So, how are you funded? I mean, in your bio here, fundraising comes up pretty fast. So how are you funded? And is there a difference between funding for programs and funding for advocacy, for example?
Yes, there is absolutely a difference. What's interesting, we've had funders like we have private funders, we have fundraisers, we have our major donors, Patty and George Krause, who are incredibly wonderful to us and committed to us over this course of the beginning of our work. But we interestingly just got a little bit of money from Capital One, and we're seeing, JP Morgan is announcing this, right? The banks are talking about giving back. Certainly they should. And one of the interesting things that Capital One's program folks said to me was, the reason that we decided to fund you versus somebody else is because you're not just doing direct service. You're not just doing advocacy. You're actually informing your advocacy with those you've done direct service with. And that's really the sweet spot in terms of where I see the work going. It's okay to hand out that turkey on Thanksgiving, and it's okay to give, like we give reentry bags filled with a weekend full of materials and support for women coming home from jail. But if that's all you do, you've missed the mark. And, women coming home have so much potential, and men, to give back, to be empowered. We were in Albany, and so many of our women who were there were saying how it feels so good to be a productive member of the community, to give back, and to say, here's what has to change about the system. Many years ago, Eddie Ellis was talking about this. My friend Glenn, we were all talking about directly impacted people are the folks that can best change the system.
That's
we
it.
know it inside
the people
and out.
closest to the problem are closest to the solution.
Glenn's been here.
Yes. Yes. So,
when you go up to Albany, you find that the legislators are interested in stories. They're interested in the actual impact of the justice system on people who are affected. Yeah.
One of the things I realized very quickly, and this was back when I was working at the Correctional Association, if you don't have a moving narrative, if you don't have a memorable story that can help a legislator see a situation as a person, humanizing it is so important. And what I realized were a lot of the women we worked with had never told their story before and were nervous and maybe didn't know how to explain things and maybe hadn't even internalized and thought about how they were involved in their crime or what were the things that led them down that pathway and how do they explain that. And so my work with her story, we began to help explore how women and men can tell their stories about the impact of their lives and do it for a purpose, to help others change. And I always say that, you can talk stats, you can talk facts, but the one thing you'll remember is my story.
Yes.
You're going to remember the pieces of somebody's life experience versus anything else. And so if we want lawmakers to really affect change for those of us who've been incarcerated in our families, we need to be honest and vocal and vulnerable, right? So it's not easy to tell your story, but
agree.
It's so important.
So as we wind down, we got a few minutes left. What are you most hopeful about as you do this work?
I find it so rewarding to see women come into my office and get what I didn't get, which was an open arm, a warm handshake, a bag of supplies, a space to identify as somebody who's a survivor of incarceration. We always say formerly incarcerated, right? Returning citizens. But I say survivor, because if you've been to prison, you know you've survived something.
And it doesn't matter how long you've gone. If you spent 20 minutes, you've survived
You've survived it.
So yes,
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, and the years leading up to and the years coming home from, I mean, it's an ordeal. People
it doesn't end when you walk out that door.
People don't know. Every sentence is a life sentence.
Yes.
Every sentence is a life sentence. That's so important because, you know, in the work I've done over the last 20 years, it takes so long to identify, move on, and you never fully move on, right? If you hear certain things, they can trigger. You hear keys sound a certain way, you remember officers' keys. You smell certain soap, and you remember the state soap. I mean, we're laughing, but these are things that I mean, you know, right? Like, these are traumatizing things.
I know exactly.
Triggering.
I know exactly. Laughing with identification.
Identification.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Identification.
Yeah.
You know, you wake up at 2:00 in the morning, and you're like, okay,
where am I?
Where am I?
Yeah.
I know.
And I think that while the move towards ending mass incarceration is so important, I think we still have so far to go to understand the victimization of women. You know, I still feel there is no good reason a mother should be incarcerated. That she should be in rehab or in treatment in a facility where her child can be with her. You know, you're destroying children's lives when you have their primary caretaker not with them. And I think if there's, I'd love to see in the next, 25 years, a different model, a completely different model than the one we have to a restorative justice model, right? We talk about this a lot. Instead of just incarcerate, throw away the key, victimize, abuse, and throw them back to the street to start over.
Yes. Thank you so much, Serena Ligori.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Before we get off, we want to get your contact information out there. And here in Connecticut and Suffolk County, we get each other's radio stations.
Yes.
And we're live streaming and this podcasting as well. So a lot of people will be able to hear this. So why don't you, pitch your fundraising and tell everyone how to contact you.
If you'd like to give, if you'd like to fund work with our moms and kids and women, or you'd like to volunteer, you'd like to intern, come and visit our office. We're at 1725 Brentwood Road, Brentwood, New York, 11717. You can visit our website, www.newhourli.org. And you can also email us at contactus@newhourli.org. And we are really grateful because we've had such a groundswell of support in the community. They've said, I never knew this was out there. Oh, I've wanted to work with women in prison before. I'm a social worker, or I've survived substance abuse or domestic violence, and I'd love to give back. So thank you for helping us share a little bit about our work.
It's been our pleasure to have you on.
We're very excited as we branching out farther and farther from Connecticut that you're our Long Island representative now. Was Boomer Esiason from Brentwood?
What's that?
Remember the football player? Is he from there? I don't know. Maybe.
I don't know.
I don't know football.
We got to get some Brentwood people to support you.
Yes. I would love to have some support on Long Island.
Well, thank you so much for being our guest today, and I hope you come back.
Absolutely, I would love to.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
We got
this
another
is a great show.
Thank you to the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven.
Now more than ever.
Travel safely, Andrew.
And how? And on your ferry ride.
I will be on the ferry ride.
And thank you, Lynn, for supporting us too.
Okay. And love you, Babz.
Love you too, Jeff Grant.
Okay.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Brian Slattery.
Badeng juguna jampa mi kala jampa ni